There are a few areas of public policy where the gap between political instinct and economic reality is wider than antitrust. A big company grows powerful, people grow suspicious, politicians demand action, and regulators constantly face pressure to act. But what if their intervention, which is meant to protect competition, actually ends up protecting incumbents? What if privacy rules meant to protect consumers make it harder for smaller firms to compete? And what if the real cost of bad regulation is the innovation we never get to see? Today's guest founded and leads the International Center for Law and Economics, a research center focused on antitrust, consumer protection, telecom, IP, and technology regulation. He brings a law and economics lens to some of the biggest fights in modern policy, from big tech and platform power to privacy, data, AI, and the future of competition law. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Geoffrey Manne to the big questions. Geoffrey, how are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me, John. I really appreciate it.
I'm looking forward to a great conversation because I think these topics that your pieces in really are top of mind for a lot of people, certainly in the U.S. and I would dare say worldwide right now, with the advent and the spectacular growth of AI and other areas. So, before we start, I want to get a little bit of background on you. You're both a lawyer and an economics. I don't know if professor is the right word, but an economics guy. And so first of all, why don't we talk about that?
Okay.
Did you first start out with an interest in economics and then migrated to law, or was it vice versa?
I kind of uniquely started out right in the intersection of the two because my father, Henry Manne, was one of the founders of this discipline called law and economics. He was one of the first people who brought economics to the analysis of legal questions. And so, I mean, from the time I was born, I was sort of hearing about law and economics. My middle name is Adam, named after Adam Smith. I mean,
Of course.
where else could you? So I sort of grew up with both, and I'm not very good at math, so I went into law. I mean, that's really the. That's not really true, but yeah, my formal training is in law because law and economics really has evolved as a discipline in the legal field, much more so than in economics, which is itself kind of an interesting question we could talk about. But yeah, but
I was
I was born into it.
So you were born into it, but the way you kind of described it is, correct me if I'm wrong, I might put you in you're a lawyer who has a specialty and an interest in economics. Is that a fair way of describing your discipline?
Sure. Yeah, there are a lot of people in the discipline who have PhDs in economics who really consider themselves economists and who just sort of happen to look at legal questions, which are, of course, very interesting. And as you pointed out in your introduction, the kind of thing that people really care about. So, it sort of makes sense. In a way, law and economics is just, I mean, well, maybe this is my bias, but it's just law to me. It's just, how else would you look at it? Why would you not ask questions about incentives and how people respond to changes in the law and what the consequences of legal rules are? And it's just common sense, I guess.
And it does seem like a natural sort of blending of the two. And I understand what you mean because in some ways, when I describe my own background sometimes to someone, they'll say, "Well, you were a coder, you were a biologist, you were, you went into sports analytics and everything," and they go, "Oh my God, it's so different." And I go, "Yeah, but at the end of the day, I'm counting things." So
Yeah.
it's just natural. I'm just someone who likes counting, which is my wife's favorite way of describing her husband's profession.
I'm sure.
Count things, right? So I kind of get where you're coming from. That to you, it just seems like a natural intersection of two disciplines that you just grew up saying, how else would I look at the law, or how else
Right.
would I look at
Right.
economics, right? Cool. And the other thing I noticed in your bio was you're from the Chicago University of Chicago School,
Yeah.
which of course immediately I like you because you come, I would hope, from the Milton Friedman tree of economics, and perhaps viewing economics through that world lens. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I was both an undergrad and law student at Chicago, and it's funny. I went there. Actually, this finally answers your earlier question. I went there thinking I was going to study economics as an undergrad, and I sort of fell in with the Alan Bloom sort of Straussian crowd and got interested in political philosophy, and uh, and sort of abandoned the formal Chicago economics training. But like I said, it was seeping in through my dad. And anyway, and but that's definitely the classic Chicago school is definitely where I was grounded, and yeah, that's Milton Friedman and Gary Becker and George Stigler and a whole host of real luminaries. Uh, the sort of gloss on that I would put is, well, there's two. One is that there's one aspect of area of economics that's been very influential to me that probably a lot of people would say is part of the Chicago school is what we would call the UCLA school. This is economists, a little bit less household names, Armin Alchin, Harold Demsetz. Uh, it's a What's most interesting about it is how um, I guess it's a very verbal tradition. It's very well. It lends itself to the study of legal issues really very naturally because it is it's so sort of logical and it's all about the economic way of thinking, much more so than the formulas and Greek letters. Not that they don't do that, but it's impossible to describe in less than 6,000 words. But it's a really sort of unique way of thinking, but very much in line with the kind of Chicago approach. And the other thing I would just mention, because it's interesting to me, and I know you have had a number of guests in this tradition, is the Austrian tradition, which is sort of tangentially uh, um, associated with Chicago. Certainly, there was influence on a lot of the people there, and in a lot of places today, it kind of gets short shrift, I think. And like the UCLA school, I actually think that this is why it's been influential to me. The Austrian way of thinking is leave aside the monetary stuff, which I don't really know much about, and which is probably where the biggest controversy is. The idea of seeing, in my realm, antitrust, competition as a discovery process, which is a phrase that Hayek invented, not invented, but used. The idea of dynamic, evolving economy, the limitations of knowledge. So many elements of that are have been extremely influential to me. I didn't get them from Chicago. They're a little bit different than Chicago, but it's not
Right.
too far afield. And I wish it were better appreciated than it is, because I think it's also really a powerful way to view the world.
Right. And I guess for before we get a little bit deeper, to set the framework for our viewers that may not be aware, I'm going to draw an analogy. It'll probably stink, and you'll correct me. But like the Chicago School of Economics is more closely associated, like if you're a classical liberal or a constitutionalist or a minarchist, like that political philosophy tends to align with the Chicago Economic School, right? Then that'll be the Milton Friedmans and the Thomas Sowells of the world for as household names, whereas the Austrian economic philosophy tends to align with the more hardcore libertarians, the minarchists, the anarchists tend to view their economic lens tends to be more Austrian, like Hayek and Mises and others, right? Would you think that's a fair sort of alignment if we were to describe the politics and the economics like in those vast groups? I know they're not precise. I'm just trying to give our viewers a
Yeah, No, I think it's fair. I mean, if you think of a bell curve, I think you're describing the core in a sense of each of those. But there's plenty of overlap on either side. You could be a I think you could be a Chicago school economist, someone who understands and appreciates the power of price theory, and uh, and not be a classical liberal. Be a a Paul Samuelson, a very famous economist, Nobel Prize winning economist, very much a lefty. Uh, Also very much a Chicago school economist. I think a real price theory guy. Um, because economics doesn't have an inherent sort of ideological valence to it. It's about understanding the world. Now, it might these schools of economics might lead you to ask different questions that might lead you in a direction that tends toward a particular sort of political philosophy, but it's really not sort of required by the economics. What you're describing is possibly not a function of the economics underlying it, but just the sort of normative, kind of culture that has built up around each of those areas. So I think it's very accurate in this, the core of what you said, but I also don't think it precludes people with very divergent views, political or ideological views, um, espousing those areas of economics.
Yeah, that's very interesting the way you formulated that because I suppose you're right. There's no formal requirement from the economic side to have a political ideology. But it's interesting how each political ideology, which is, I assume, perfectly human and natural, to use a particular economic ideology or school of thought to justify their ideology. It's the classic cherry picking, right? Like
Yeah,
you're not going to find someone who views the world top down, so who thinks that things should be from a collective authority and then everything filtered down to the
right,
individual. They're going to be Keynesians or Marxists or socialists for the most part, right? And they're
right,
going to travel to those economic schools of thought, whereas the more individualistic, like libertarians and classical liberals or conservatives would obviously tend to find the justification of their political ideologies in certain types of economic systems. So that's interesting. I never really thought it through to that extent, but I understand what you mean. What gap did you see out there that led you to help found the International Center for Law and Economics? What did you see out there that said, I got to start this because I can't find it anywhere else?
yeah. That's it's a great question. I was a law professor. I mean, after training and all of that, I was teaching law school, and I live in Portland, Oregon. That's where I was. I was at Lewis and Clark Law School, and um, Microsoft asked me to run this law and economics outreach program that they were starting up, and so I took a leave of absence from teaching, and I went to do this program, which was largely about um, bringing the law and economics sort of way of thinking together with these big issues that were facing big technology companies. So antitrust, obviously, number one on the list, but there are a lot of them, IP and broader tech regulation and stuff. and and what it's funny. What clearly was going on there was, if you remember the big Microsoft antitrust case, um, Microsoft really found itself sort of flat-footed. They had a kind of uh, vague understanding of the import of what they were doing, but when asked in a judicial process to defend it concretely, it was very hard to do actually, and that's not uncommon. Business people are focused on what's in front of them. They're trying to make profits. They're not planning. They're not a social planner who's trying to like optimize the economy. But if you ask them, if they thought about it, they could say, "Oh yeah, actually this is good for the world, and here's kind of why." But I don't know how to formalize it. And they sort of forgot, or not forgot. They just didn't have a chance, I guess, to sort of get the economists and similar folks looking at those issues to try to provide some more formal structure to explain why what they were doing might actually have been good for innovation and good for long-term economic consequences. So they lost the case in part, I think, because they didn't have that. that structure. So they sort of realized, well, some more relationship between academia, between research, between what's going on in theory and sits in those books on the shelves, and what we're actually facing might be useful. And that was really sort of the spur for this whole thing. I after spending some time there, I realized it wasn't just Microsoft that had this lapse of kind of connection between the academy, which is which, like it or not, is extremely important, especially in law, for influencing policy, and what they were actually facing in the in the policy world. Not least because they could see, they were either facing immediately or could see what was coming down the road, and the academics were still looking at articles that were written 30 years ago. So that was sort of the impetus. Was I saw that there was value in having a kind of a matchmaking function, and it wasn't about trying to advocate on behalf of these companies. I don't really care what they're I I only care whether they succeed or fail, to the extent that that's good or bad for the people. But but there was a real sort of lack of information exchange, lack of understanding, a real opportunity to do better academic research and to have that fuel better policy. And so I decided to sort of make that happen. As a side note, I would note that that I also really wanted law and economics to thrive as a field within law.
Right.
And while when my dad was building the enterprise along with others, it was there were foundations that were funding it. It was it was scrappy, but it had a real oomph behind it. That those foundations had closed their doors intentionally, spent themselves out of existence. The Olin Foundation, you may have heard of, the primary one. There was just sort of less. Law and economics had kind of gone mainstream. Like I said, it was almost like law was law and economics, and
Right.
so what's the point in in focusing on this as a specific field? Which to me meant eventually it was going to be co-opted by the left or die, and or both. And so the side benefit was, unfortunately, I didn't have an endowment that I could use to, like an Olin Foundation, so I could use this enterprise to essentially raise money that I could use to support researchers and this movement more broadly, which is what we've done. We have 100 or so academic affiliates. We make grants. We put on programs. We do a lot with young scholars to try to introduce them to aspects of law and economics and help them understand ways that can inform their work. And so I just thought I'd make it almost like a plug for that, because it's not what we're going to talk about today. It's not the
Yeah.
policy side of what we do, but it's a very important part of why I started the organization.
No, and I think that's fantastic because as you were talking, I was thinking like, oh my goodness, I hadn't realized that working or being associated with Microsoft, and I'm assuming this is in the early 90s, maybe, if my own memory serves me correctly.
Oh yeah, that was. I was there in the early 2000s, but yes, what you're talking.
Yeah, because I remember being in the tech field back then. You would always read about potential antitrust suits against Microsoft and their packaging of their browser with their operating system. Like people forget it. It's not just the US, it's Europe, it's the Asian Rim. It's not just US law, it's international law. It's so fascinating. We could go off in that direction for several hours and I'd be happy to listen to you. But one that's like a lot of people, I think, hear the word that I'm about to utter, and immediately they get images of villains tying fair damsels to the train tracks and twirling their mustache, and that's antitrust, right? I think just in terms of basic schooling and stuff, we're all taught that antitrust is like the bane of American economics it's the worst byproduct of capitalism, where all these greedy billionaires get together, they control markets, they prevent competition. And in my youth, I remember watching Milton Friedman on probably Free to Choose or something similarly, and he made the point that with the possible now again, this is going back 25 years, so take the example with a grain of salt, but he did say, I remember saying, A colleague and I committed a study, and to the best of our knowledge, the only monopoly that exists in the world that was not created by government was the De Beers Diamond Company. That he said, of all the cases I could find, that's the only one that arose naturally without government creating the monopoly. And that struck a lot of people as strange because isn't our government supposed to prevent monopolies? Don't we have so-called antitrust laws that are supposed to, break up
Yeah.
ITT and all that, right? So, first of all, if you don't mind, talk to us about the concept of antitrust in the context of American economics, American society. And then, if you don't mind, as part two, explain why most people, the knowledge that I just described, learning, say, in grade
Yeah.
school, in high school, might not be accurate.
Okay, that's like a whole course, but yes, I'll try to
Okay.
distill that
We'll
into.
try to distill it into a couple of
Yeah,
minutes. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So antitrust is, in its best incarnation, it's about sort of preserving the competitive process. It's about understanding that there are times when companies are always out for themselves, right? And true, and that actually goes to some of the answer to the second part of your question. There's no doubt that companies are out for themselves. Not only that, they're required by law to be out for
I was going to say
themselves.
they have
So,
a public company has a fiduciary duty to maximize profit, right?
exactly right. Right
Yeah, yeah.
now, but we understand that one way to maximize profits is to, in a sense, take advantage of consumers or input providers or competitors, in a way that economists have shown is not socially valuable. That if you could, that while it might be profitable for the company, it creates what's called deadweight loss. It creates high prices that lead to fewer transactions happening, which means the people who would buy stuff and receive utility from it don't get to, because the price is too high, so it's not worth it to them. And that may maximize profits for the company, but it does not maximize social welfare. And the idea behind antitrust is to say, well, if we could identify when that happens, um, it's not going to, sort of naturally correct itself. So we need the government to come in and fix it when that happens, and everyone will be better off. If we could reliably fix it, or even better, deter it from ever happening in the first place, uh, we'll have an increase in social welfare and, greater economic growth and all of this stuff. The problem is the the things that, I mean, once you get past direct, collusion, once you get past the cartel, the guys in the hotel room, the smoky back room saying, "Listen, you cut output here, we'll cut output there, we'll raise prices, and we'll be happy." Once you get past that, the things that companies do or might do to facilitate this uh, uh, taking advantage, I guess, let's call it, uh, the ways they would restrict output to increase prices get very complicated and start to look exactly like the things you would expect them to do if they were maximizing social welfare. The very, very rigorous competition looks an awful lot like very rigorous monopolization. Companies trying to get a leg up on their competitors, for example, they're always trying to get a leg. We want them to try to get a leg up on their competitors. And antitrust says, well, we have an ability to identify when getting a leg up on your competitors is actually bad for society versus this, set of conduct that is getting a leg up on your competitor, but is good for society. And that's the Austrians, for example, would be the first to tell you that's crazy. You can't possibly differentiate between those two. And it's the effort to try to differentiate between those two has led to millions of pages of economic research and economic output and pretty sophisticated stuff. And we have absolutely gotten better in our ability to differentiate between those two things. There are more and more categories of conduct that might not have seemed so clearly to fall on one side of that line in the past that we think we're pretty sure, typically we understand how they might today. But that's still a small percentage of the conduct that companies engage in. So
Right.
what you have is this enterprise that is meant to maximize welfare for society, but is almost always, no, that's not fair, is very likely to do it wrong, to commit errors in trying to maximize welfare for society, and in doing so hurt society. So I can't remember your initial question, but the point is to say that in theory, antitrust is important and valuable. It facilitates or preserves competition, which is the thing that drives
Right.
economic growth and innovation. And in practice, it's so hard to do that many of us are pretty sure that we're usually getting it wrong. So we have to be really careful. Even if we think we can tell a story about why, Microsoft bundling its browser with its operating system, we can tell a story about how that could prevent a competitor from entering this market and competing with Microsoft in a sort of convoluted way. But um, but it also could describe an efficiency. I mean,
Right.
Microsoft said in that case, Microsoft said, look, they're integrated. They're not separable. We integrate our browser with the operating system because we want it to be an intrinsic part of the operating system. This is the way coding works. This is the way we're designing it to be an intrinsic part of the system. Not to try to foreclose anyone from competing here, but because it's a better product that way.
And that's what I was going to say. The perfect example of that later, of course, was Apple and their famous closed systems, right? Whereas, with Apple, everything is made to work with other Apple products and the introduction of non-Apple products. And but again, there's that fine line, right? Like, so I like the way you kind of laid that out. But talk to
Can I just put? Can I just add, in case your listeners don't know, there is a pending antitrust suit right now against Apple. That's built around exactly what you described. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but it's essentially saying your integrated system is anti-competitive, and it was initially brought under the Biden administration, I think. Might have actually been the first Trump administration, but it's been carried forward, and it's actually been pending for quite a while. Uh, but I just, to be clear, what you described is absolutely, at sort of first glance, the kind of thing that one would think might be anti-competitive, and indeed, the Department of Justice has decided that it is. They'll lose the case. I'm certain,
Okay.
for also for reasons you suggested. But yeah,
Well, and this is the part that, say, as a free marketeer, as a libertarian, call me what you will, but of being of that sort of mindset, I've always struggled with that, right? Because I do understand that competition is what keeps society improving, right? And makes that social utility maximized, is that I'm constantly competing for my own benefit. You said you're named after Adam Smith, right? Classic, economic theory. But at the same time, we can't turn someone like they can't turn a blind eye to how companies, individuals may manipulate our belief in antitrust to their advantage and actually minimize the whether it's an intended consequence or not. Something,
yeah,
and I'll throw this at you. You tell me if it fits. Something I remember reading in an article somewhere a long time ago. There's a hummus company named Sabra, and the first thing they did when they
yeah,
got a certain majority market share in the U.S. was they went straight to the government and said, as a hummus company, we insist that you pass strict safety and quality
yeah,
standards.
right,
And of course, now someone listening goes, what's wrong with that? Like, why wouldn't we want safer food, higher quality hummus, and whatever, right? Well, of course, the reason is once you hit 60% market share, you're in a position to implement and abide by government regulation where it becomes a moat to your competitors economically, right?
yep.
So is that along the lines for or folks like something that initially seems like a good idea? Hey, the social benefit here is we're not going to get lousy hummus and we're not going to, get food poisoning from it.
Right,
That's the
right,
surface example, but the underlying reason is we want to maintain our 60% market share and grow it even more.
right. So the UCLA economists I talked about, one of them is named Harold Demsetz, and he uh, coined a phrase in, I think it was like 1975 or something, called the nirvana fallacy, which you may have heard of. You may not have heard of Harold Dempsey's, but I guarantee you understand the concept of the nirvana fallacy. And the nirvana fallacy is basically when we look at policy and we identify some sort of problem in the market, and we identify what would solve that problem, and we assume that the market is operating badly and that the solution would work perfectly. And therefore we say, well, okay, here's the problem, here's the solution, it will work perfectly, and we should clearly that world would be better. What it leaves out is the imperfection of the enforcement regime, right? The government is not omniscient, and sadly they are almost omnipotent, which means that there will always be companies and people working in government with an incentive to sort of take advantage of that kind of power. So this is it's a great example where um, I love the way you described it. Right, people would look at this and say, "What's wrong with higher quality food standards? This is good." And someone might even say, "And enforcing these standards is really cheap. It's a couple of investigators. It's a $10 million program, which in the government is literally less than a penny." But if it can be co-opted by competitors to punish or to hurt their rivals, not through actual competition in the market, not by having a better product or innovating or finding a cheaper way to produce things, but just by building a regulatory barrier to their competition, um, then then when you're calculating the costs and benefits, it's not just the direct cost of enforcement, it's the cost of lost innovation, lost competition, et cetera. And so this is, the nirvana fallacy is where you say, you forget those sort of extenuating circumstances, and you just look at the, perfect enforcement against an imperfect world. But the reality is very different. And antitrust has a long history of being used by competitors to harm their rivals, especially in situations. It's not just, in fairness, it's not just about incumbents protecting their advantage. It is often that, but it's also about challengers. Think. It's a good example here. Google and Microsoft have been actually playing this game for a very long time.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit weird to say, that these are massive companies, but there was a time, and there's still, it's still true, right? Where Google is the sort of the dominant incumbent. Microsoft is a startup challenger in the search space, right? Weird to call Microsoft that, but and historically, Microsoft has very clearly attempted to use antitrust enforcement against Google as a way to bolster its ability to compete with Google, not by doing better, but just by sort of, in a sense, by tearing Google down a little bit. And they learned that because it's exactly what happened to them in the cases that were brought against them. And ironically, Google was one of the companies that helped facilitate the bringing of the case against Microsoft in Europe that you
Right.
mentioned. It's not just a US case. Um, so it's not just it is incumbents like Sabra, protecting their market share. It's also challengers trying to get a leg up in really like the hardest part of competition. You can understand why they would want it,
Sure.
sure, but it's not good for society. And it just to round it off. Remember, in the background, sometimes it is good. That's the real problem. That sometimes they're right, even though Google is trying to use the government to advantage itself against Microsoft, it might actually be right. And doing so might actually also be good for society. That's the real sort of conundrum of antitrust. It's so indeterminate because it turns on predicting economic effects years into the future. It's not murder. For example, is not perfectly determinate. We don't know who did it, what their intention was, et cetera. But there's like an act and an outcome,
It's
and
limited.
almost always there's a dead body, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
In antitrust, there's almost never a dead body.
yeah.
There's almost never. It's something that's going to happen in the future, or it's maybe something that happened in the past, but you're connecting it. You're saying, well, okay, prices have gone up, and you're telling a story about why, but there could be an infinite number of causes for that, and you're suggesting it's this cause, but
Right.
you could be wrong. Always indeterminate,
Yeah.
and yet could be good, could be bad. What do you do?
Well, I was going to ask you, once you get outside of the collusory type of antitrust, where there's the guys in the room saying, like OPEC, where they say we're going to oil at this price, right? Once you get past that, as you mentioned, would you? And I'm going to ask you a very broad question, which I'm sure will be difficult for you, but would you say antitrust in the United States has been a net positive or a net negative for
Wow.
society?
I mean, if we knew the answer to that, I would have a better answer to the prior question.
What's your gut feeling? Would you say?
Yeah. Um, God. Uh, well, let me answer just first by giving
Sure.
a kind of hedged sort of historical answer. Uh, Historically, antitrust has been terrible. Um, Up until the University of Chicago economics department came along, it was absolutely a public choice nightmare. It was very much a tool for abuse by competitors against their rivals, by the government to effectuate non-economic policies. I mean, one of the worst antitrust bills we have, the Robinson-Patman Act. I won't go into what it is, but I can tell you that it was essentially written by the association of small grocery stores. I mean, it was written by a group of retailers who didn't like who felt like they wished they could increase their bargaining power with wholesalers. They got an antitrust law written that basically enshrined that preference. That's not a social welfare preference. That is absolutely rent seeking, right? And from approximately the beginning of antitrust in the United States at the turn of the century up until 1970-ish, 19 yeah, the 1970s, it was unequivocally a net bad. Then Chicago economics comes along, and Robert Bork comes along, and the courts start to listen to the economic analysis of law, and they start to see these complexities. They start to see that just because you can tell a story about why conduct A leads to bad outcome B, that's not necessarily the case. And you got to be more careful about it. You have to consider the cost of erroneous enforcement, deterrent effects, all this stuff. And antitrust got a lot better. Some people would say it got a lot worse. They would say the sort of the populists, a lot of the ascendant political movements today are very big fans of antitrust because it's a very powerful tool the government can use, or they can use, to sort of influence the government in directions they care about, like favoring small mom and pop businesses over big companies. That's a political or aesthetic preference. It's not an economic one. It could be good in certain circumstances, but typically there are benefits from scale and efficiencies, and it's kind of a silly economic position, but it's a political one, and antitrust is really useful at furthering that position. That's a lot harder to do today because of the influence of Chicago economics. And so, while I can say unequivocally antitrust was a net bad up until then, since then there have been some glaring errors in enforcement, and there have been some cases that I think were probably right, and more importantly, the threat of those cases probably deterred some companies from engaging in bad conduct that would have been bad for society. Now, it also deterred them from engaging in conduct that would have been good for society because it's so hard to tell the difference. And they say, well, we think this would be great, but we're going to get in antitrust trouble if we do this, even though it's clearly the efficient thing to do. But it'll be hard to defend in court, right? So again, this is the problem I've been talking about all along. But I think it's possible that the good outweighs the bad since in the last 50-ish years of antitrust. I think it's probably unlikely, but it's possible. But it
Mm,
was not possible in the first, 80 years of antitrust.
gotcha, gotcha. So it was horrible, and now it's might be getting better now. What fascinates me is, unlike, say, and not even that it's clear in tax law, but I mean, if I have a scheme I plan on doing, I could always get my tax lawyer or my accountant and say, "Is this legal? Is this something that would pass muster in tax court?" And I could be relatively certain that if I get a good enough attorney, I can get a determination one way or another. It seems to me like you can't do that with antitrust. You can't. There's no antitrust authority that you could go to and say, if I pursue business policy A, are you guys likely to,
Yeah,
there?
yeah.
So it
Well,
does seem like
here's
entrepreneurs are adrift, right?
yes, but like everything else, there are two sides to it, and in a way, that's one of the saving graces of antitrust. Let me say why. So, the tax code is what, like 100 volumes long. I mean, it's massive, right? It is. So we used to have this game in law school where you would open the tax code at a random place, and you go to the end of the language, and there's always these references to other parts of the code that you have to like understand to understand this code. And the game was, see if you can get to an end point, before you die, basically.
Right.
And I don't think it ever happened. I mean, there was not a single section of the tax code that didn't require you to look at some other section of the tax code, some other section. But there is actually an endpoint. The point is that virtually everything you need to know, virtually every, of course, not every aspect. That's why there's still cases, but virtually every aspect of sort of tax law you need to know is written down in these massive volumes of books. Okay, the operative language, if you strip away um, the flowery 1890s verbiage, the operative language of the Sherman Antitrust Act is approximately 24 words long, and that's it. And uh, it basically says, don't monopolize things. And courts figure out what that means, right? Now, since then, so this is why I say this is sort of the beauty of the system. It's effectively a common law system created by statute. There's the content of antitrust law, with some important exceptions. There have been subsequent statutes that are a little bit more detailed, but not much. The content of antitrust law has been determined over time by courts interpreting, looking at unknown conduct and with unknown effects and trying to figure them out and iterating on that. I mean, this is the beauty of antitrust, I would say. Um, it also is what makes it completely indeterminate. Well, not completely indeterminate. As I said, over time we have learned more and more about where that line is drawn. I think more and more. I don't want to overstate that. There's still nearly infinite amounts on either side of it, and we've maybe moved it. I don't know what the right image is, but we've made it. Maybe it's like this. We made it a little bit more like this, but um, uh, but that you could say that's a good thing though, because if we wrote down in the statute, in fact, so that there's some proposed statutes right now. This one called ICOA that Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota and Grassley and a couple of others are pushing. It gets a lot more specific. It basically says, here's some things that we don't want you to do. One of them is something called self-preferencing. That means you go to Google, you search for an address, and a Google map pops up, and you can click on the map, and it tells you where to go. Well, that's self-preferencing because Google is providing search, but they're preferencing their map service. And the argument that some people make is, well, it's just like Microsoft bundling, the browser with its operating system. That's bad for competition. Google should have to let anyone provide the map in this context. And this law, I'm glossing over a lot, but this law would like mandate that. There's no economic evidence to suggest. I mean, there's actually economic evidence. To the extent there is economic evidence, it almost all points in the direction of self-preferencing is beneficial for markets and for society. But this law would outlaw it in certain contexts.
Mm.
Well, that's bad. You might have certainty because of that, but if the certainty is wrong, if you're certain about something wrong, it's not so great. So so the indeterminacy of antitrust has been both its it's you know it's bane and it's saving grace, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Um,
that's interesting because, um, I think a lot of folks who are not lawyers always have an assumption that there must be a law somewhere.
yeah,
That if
or
not,
there ought to be a law.
there ought to be a law somewhere that at least lays out a ground rule. Something that we can all agree should or should not be the case. And like you said, you might need a court to suss out who's in the right, who's in the wrong, and whether assumptions are. But at least, like you said, in that tax code, right? Even though it's circular in a lot of ways, at least it's all in there somewhere, and you have to find a good attorney
Yeah,
to stop.
finding it is hard, but
Yeah, but it's there, right?
right.
Very interesting. Let me
Well, and
go
oh,
ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no,
Okay, I was gonna.
there are more interesting things to talk about, I'm sure.
Oh,
But
no,
go
I
ahead.
was gonna say I could talk antitrust for you for hours. I'm sure. I don't know if that would make for the greatest episode. So why don't we just maybe bring in a hot topic right now, which is AI. All right. The Now I tend to take a more measured outlook on AI, which is to me it's a tool. We always have cycles of both immense and lightning fast innovation, especially in recent decades, right? So if you're old enough to have gray hair like you and I have, we've seen this cycle play out, whether it was with the internet or the PC or the cell phone, right? Like there were certain technical innovations. The law has to catch up to those technical innovations, right? Because there's just some things that were not foreseen. Um, in terms of AI, do you think that what we're seeing now, like a lot of lawmakers pressing for brakes, pressing for government regulation, some would say over regulation, uh, classifying certain types of AI as what's it, national secrets of national importance, of national security. Um, do you feel that the voices in that camp should be heeded and promoted, or do you fall more in the line as some folks think, like, hey, let Anthropic and OpenAI and AI, XAI, and all those companies, let them do what they're going to do, and as long as they're not causing harm or causing monetary loss or otherwise doing direct harm, let them do what they're going to do, and then we'll deal with the fallout. Like, if you could wave a magic wand and say one approach over the other will
Hmm.
rule the land, how would you approach it?
Sometimes I wish that the issues that I studied had easy, clear answers.
Okay.
I I guess I'd be out of a job if that were the case. So I guess I don't really wish that, but but it is frustrating that virtually every question someone asks, relating to areas that I know something about, the answer is, well, it depends. So I sound like an economist, I guess. Um, Look, from to a first cut, and from a very um, sort of blunt, almost like PR perspective, um, it's very clear that the anti-regulatory crowd has the better argument, that regulation at this stage will inevitably, and I mean that literally, inevitably get it wrong, stymie the path and the speed of innovation, um, do more harm than good, probably aggrandize our you know geopolitical enemies at our expense. Like, though, that's all pretty clearly true, not least because of what you said, because legislation, and for that matter courts, are always behind the technology. That's just sort of necessarily the case, but um, you should be realistic about that. You should have some humility and say, well, okay, so knowing that we don't really understand, and that there's a real risk that we will enshrine something in law that absolutely redirects the whole path of the world in a worse direction. We should be careful about what we're doing. Like that is absolutely the case. But at the same time, um, like is true with other technologies, they can be used for bad. It can be used for bad. I think thinking that there's something really very different about AI is probably incorrect. I mean, it's more powerful than lots of technologies that have come before, but it's also like, I think, we've had general purpose technologies before. We understand a lot of the dynamics. It's not, I don't think it's, so um, uh, novel that we can't sort of, understand at least directionally where the kind of fault lines are, where the problems are. And there's some obvious risks. And it would also be silly to say, look, the government can't take national security into account in regulating this technology. That would be crazy. And I, this is a classic problem for libertarians. You know, if you concede, as Milton Friedman always did, that national defense is absolutely a valid sort of function of the government, and it's one that requires some secrecy and requires a lack of transparency and requires other things that aren't what you would call the optimal rule of law or due process or something, but they're necessary to properly engaging in national security or self defense, national defense. Um, yeah, that's a tough position for libertarians to be in, but it's the reality. And I think there's no question that AI is a real risk. And it would be a mistake to completely take away the ability of the government to do anything about that, which just leaves you in the crazy making position, because the question of what should they be able to do and how can we judge it and how can we monitor it and how can we put constraints on it, is these are impossible questions to answer. So my first inclination is, whoa, right? Humility. Right now there's like 1,500 laws across the United States proposed to regulate AI, and it's a exaggeration, but not a crazy one, to say there are 1,500 different laws, like different ways of doing it. It can't all be right, and many of them are clearly wrong. And frankly, if we implemented even like 10 of them and had to have companies trying to comply with 10 different laws simultaneously, it would be potentially disastrous, right? There, um, there's almost no question that we need to put on the brakes, not on AI, on the how we regulate it. But I don't have an answer to the question of what exactly we do with the actual risks that are there, and with the and even the well, it's really the national security risk. I think the other risks that people talk about are not really so um, so valid. The labor market risks. That's a it's possible, but I mean, we've seen this movie 100 times before,
Right.
and in every single case, the technology has changed the tasks that people perform, but actually made people more productive and increased employment and increased economic growth and increased outcome. And maybe this time is different, but when it's never been different before, it's a little bit silly to think that this time is different.
You should play
Um,
the odds.
yeah, right.
Play the odds.
With respect to I don't know, privacy risks, I think that's probably dramatically overstated. Most people don't care about that exactly the way that the advocates do. But when it comes to security risks, there's something there, and I wish I knew what to do about it.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah.
No,
So I don't know. Does that help? I mean,
it does. It does, because I think there like one of my favorite things is, can we all just be reasonable about things? And that's a loaded phrase. Obviously, I understand that, but it does
talk
seem.
about Nirvana.
Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, no. So that's a good answer. The last thing I want to touch on briefly is the concept of intellectual property.
Hmm.
Now, in addition, that if you got 10 libertarians in a room, immediately one will accuse the other nine of not really being libertarian. Once you get past that sort of genetic impulse, one of the big things that will split us is the concept of IP.
Yeah.
There are a lot of libertarians who think there's no such thing as IP, that despite their advocacy of property rights, intellectual property is not one of them. It's a made up thing. Um, and there are others who think, no, it is a valid property. You should have the right to control your intellectual property. It is from property. Give me your view on that. How do you view IP?
There's a lot of economic research, both theoretical and empirical, that says the bigger problem is under production of innovation, under investment in innovative new technologies, not over investment. um, when there's underinvestment in something, it's often, if not always, because of badly defined property rights, because there isn't a way for someone to earn a sufficiently large expected return that they're willing to take the risk up front. And information goods are way underproduced, not overproduced. And the best way that I know of to increase their likelihood of production is to assign property rights in them. There are other things you can do, but they're worse. They involve more government intervention. They involve more ex ante decision making. Like you can offer prizes. That's often noted as an example. Look, if you really want to do this, just offer a prize. But don't give anyone the ability to exclude others from using the thing that they create. Make them have to put it in the public domain, but give them $1 billion reward for doing it. Well, that means you're setting the amount of the reward in advance, the things you're giving the reward for. You're creating a government apparatus to enforce it. Not that you don't have one for IP as well, but anyway, I don't think there's any better way to do it than intellectual property rights. That doesn't mean that the exact contours of the rights that we have defined by statute, also by common law, but nowadays predominantly by statute, doesn't mean we've gotten it exactly right. I mean, in fact, it's Congress. We should assume they got it wrong. I mean, but it's directionally correct. I think there's no question, and there is a pretty strong movement. It's not. It's there are some libertarians who are in that camp, but it's mostly being directed sort of by the left uh, to tear down those intellectual property protections because they're seen as sort of tools of big corporations. I mean, it's really sort of it's part of that kind of classic the newly reinvigorated socialism capitalism debate, with those terms being very broadly defined, and and I think that's misguided. I think actually the opposite is true. That kind of property right, as including with intellectual property, gives an opportunity for the small guy to actually compete against the big guy, because they're not they're not competing on the basis of the connections they have and the money they have in the bank or whatever. They're competing on the basis of ideas, and any little guy, if he can get a patent, can have a really powerful idea, and that enables them. It actually enables them to compete with the big guys instead of the opposite. Sometimes it protects the big guys, but it's not
Right.
intrinsically that at all.
Well, interestingly, you see it play out a lot in the pharmaceutical space, right? Where
A great
perfect
example.
example, right? And a lot of like, if you work in the pharma space, a lot of pharmaceuticals say it's almost getting to the point where it doesn't pay to
Right.
come up with innovative drugs, because by the time you get a patent on it, you only have 17 years before biosimilars come in, but it takes something like 10 to 12 years to get FDA
Just to
approval
get
on
it.
everything,
Yeah.
plus all the R&D, and for every one drug that makes it, 10 don't, or whatever that ratio is. So by the
Right.
time the patent expires, you've barely recouped your money, right? So
And you're recouping your money not just for that invention, but for every other drug that you tried to create that didn't go anywhere.
I see,
Um,
but I could see
yeah.
where people would say like, "Oh, okay, but what if the majority of people can't afford the life save?" And it goes back and forth, right? Like no company would price something that they couldn't sell, right? So there's always that back and forth. I
Right.
get it, and I love your answer. Like, okay, maybe the basic premise of IP is solid, but the fine tuning the edges, like why is a patent 17 years and a copyright
Right.
what is it, 99 or whatever? Like I don't know how we came up with those numbers. Unlike
There is interesting economic theories as to why at least directionally, why patents are shorter in length than copyright, but the numbers are practically random, right? I mean, the specific numbers. Actually, in the pharmaceutical case, there's a really good, really illustrative story here, which is exactly the situation you described, right? Pharmaceutical companies invent these drugs. By the time they're actually marketed, they don't have the full patent term to earn the monopoly profits on the drugs, and they may not earn enough to actually justify the investment they made in it. So they do things like slightly change the formula or the delivery system or something like that, and get a new patent, which gives them a, they still have to go through the same process and all, but it lengthens the term.
Extends the
Now
life. Yeah.
some people look at that and say this is horrific. I mean, this is completely unjustified. This is taking advantage of the system. The law says they have this long, and they're just extending it right and left, and creating bigger monopolies and taking advantage. And others would look at it and say what you did and say, look, first of all, it's part of the law. I mean, if you don't like the law, change the law. It's how it's written. But more importantly, it may be the only thing that's actually facilitating continued investment in pharmaceutical research, because we have misjudged the length of the appropriate patent term, and given all the regulatory processes to get there, actually we're under incentivizing it. That's a great example where the um, it's very much the contours, the very specific parameters of the law that both determine whether it's sort of good or bad, and also lead to the kind of conduct that to some people looks terrible, to some people looks like trying to navigate a Byzantine sort of system. Could I imagine doing it better? Absolutely. There are lots of people who if nirvana were real and I could just wave a wand and have a different, slightly different, not hugely different patent law than we have today, I would do it, and it would be better and everyone would be better off. And yet I guarantee that if we actually try to rewrite the law, we'll make it worse. So in fact, we have in recent years, we've in my mind only made it worse in recent years. But that's a problem of the specific drafting of the law. The underlying concept is, despite what some libertarians say, look, here's my libertarian pitch: if the government should do anything, if there's anything the government should do, it should be defining and enforcing property rights,
Of course.
and that's all this is.
Yep.
So, what's to object, right?
Yeah.
Any law can be abused. This is no different, But fundamentally, it's a good thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. And like I said, if we could just be reasonable about things, I'm sure we could all come to an accommodation. But that's perhaps hoping for too much. All right,
Absolutely.
Jeffrey Mann,
Sadly, yeah.
thank you so much. I just looked up. I realized we've gone over an hour. I could keep talking to you, but as I said, unfortunately, we have to sort of define the parameters of the show. So before we wrap up, I just want to do something I call the final five. These are
Okay.
just 5 questions, no right or wrong answers, off the top of your head, just to give us a
Okay.
better idea of where you're at. Okay. Question number
Okay.
1. What is one regulation you find emotionally appealing but intellectually hard to defend?
Emotionally appealing, but intellectually hard to defend. Uh, oh God, I have great examples of this, and I just can't conjure them. Hold on, I will. You can cut this part out, right? Make it look like I just came up with this, like just in a flash, right?
If this ends up being more charming, and we'll leave it at
Universal healthcare, single payer universal healthcare. Emotionally appealing. Why should people have a hard time getting healthcare? Intellectually, catastrophe.
Yeah. No, that's a good one. And I think that's something that resonates with a lot of people, right? Why are healthcare costs so high? Because of the attempts at universal healthcare or Medicaid for or whatever. But at the same time, I can't get my medicine is a very tough
It's
emotional tug,
it's
right?
rough. It's
Yeah.
tough. Yeah, look, I know you didn't ask for two, but I mean, I like to talk. As I said, I live in Portland, and not that Portland's unique in this, but we are, to me, uniquely dealing with homelessness problems since COVID. Like it's gotten. I mean, it's you call it a homelessness problem. It's a drug problem, really, and uh, that's another one where. Um, Well, you take mentally ill people on the streets. That's not an insignificant portion of people on the streets. Uh, uh, Intellectually, I cannot condone, forcibly committing them. I mean, in some cases, I certainly can, but my libertarian instincts definitely recoil at that. And yet, um, you know, they've decimated the business environment here. I think the occupancy rate in the buildings in downtown Portland is like it's less than 50% now or something. I mean, it's crazy, right? And it's largely because the streets are a mess and they're unsafe and uh, no one has figured out what to do about it. And one of the reasons is because some of the things that would probably work are probably unappealing, or if you have any moral decency. So what do you do? I don't know. It's a tough one. So
It's never easy. I agree with you. What is the best argument for from the antitrust populists that your side too often
mm,
dismisses?
they don't have any good arguments.
Okay, that's a good one. There's nothing that you secretly say, I'm going to have to work extra hard to debunk that one.
um, no, I don't. I don't think so.
Okay,
Uh,
believe me,
I
that's a
might I might be forgetting something, but honestly, it's so they're sort of so anti-economic. I mean, and you could say, well, you just have a blinkered worldview. But I mean, if you're arguing from aesthetics and from these unfalsifiable concepts, like this is bad for democracy, you haven't defined democracy, you haven't explained how it's bad for you're
right.
just throwing words out there that sound good together. I if there's something underneath that has real content, I'd be happy to entertain it. But they're just sort of in a different universe, and it's
Right.
hard to find any common ground.
No, I feel the same way about communists. Like I've yet to hear one single argument that would convince me that oh, that's tough to explain away from my perspective.
Yeah,
Um, has there ever been a compliment about your work that secretly annoyed you more than any criticism has?
no, that's a great question.
I guess any left-handed compliments or
Yeah,
something.
yeah. Um, I mean, I've never gotten it, so I'm not answering your question. But if someone said, your work is really accessible and understandable by everyone, I would say, oh, you mean I've made it too simple and stupid that I um, but honestly, you know, I write these 60-page papers that no one reads. I should write much more accessibly and simply. And so, like, in a way, I would see that as this, as like a teardown. But in this weird reversal of your question, secretly, I would understand that actually it'd be better if I did that.
I'm chuckling, Jeffrey, because I mentioned to you before we started recording. I love talking to law professors a lot of times. I asked that question of David Bernstein, and
Mhm.
he actually gave me the same
Oh,
type of
really?
response. That he goes, "Yeah, the compliment I got once was that everyone can understand my work," and then he kind of went from there, and and
Yeah.
then and I kind of chuckled when you came up with that response because it was very similar to David. So yeah,
Well, I've known David a long time. Maybe I got it from him. Who
maybe you
knows?
got it from him. That's a great. If you could cross-examine any historical economist or jurist for just 10 minutes, who would it be, and what's the first question you would ask?
It would have to be Brandeis, um, and and I guess the question would be: do you really think these guys who are operating in your name have have any merit? I mean, like, can you disavow them or adopt them? Maybe that maybe they really this, and by your name I mean the populists in the antitrust realm today are called themselves neo-Brandeisians, and Brandeis was a very important jurist for lots of areas of law, but particularly for antitrust, and they evoke his name, um, and absolutely correctly. I mean, he had views that I think are terrible. Like he has this line about consumers that they're servile, indulgent. I can't remember the line exactly, but I mean, he hated consumption basically. Um, so it's possible that he would say, "Oh yeah, no, they're doing the Lord's work," but also he is responsible for the largely responsible for the sort of um, the framework, not the economics of, but the framework that we apply, the rational framework we apply to antitrust today is a function of it. He didn't come out and say ban everything. He was very logical. He adopted an approach that the neo-Brandeisians really don't like, and I'd like to know whether that part of his legacy he thinks is more important than the anti-consumer, small businesses uber alles sort of aspect of it.
All right, great answer. And the last question: when you're completely off the clock,
Hmm.
what topic or activity pulls you the furthest away from antitrust law and policy? What do you like to up to?
Yeah, it has to be. It has to be the band Phish. Um, it used to be the band The Grateful Dead, but and still I listen to them a lot. But I so many. But at this point, it'll stop being a surprise. I think now I've been to about 90 Phish shows, which is not many for the real sort of Phish heads, but I I love it, and yeah, it's as far removed as you can get from, because most of what I do when I'm off the clock is pretty much the same as what I do when I'm on the clock. Honestly, I have a great job. I would do it for free. Don't tell the board of directors.
Yeah.
Uh, but um, but yeah, if I really got to move away, I listen to jam band music.
Fantastic. That's great. Fantastic. All right, everyone. Geoffrey Manne, thank you so much for joining us. Please, do you have a book or a website or a Substack or something you want the folks to go to?
Yeah, sure. We have lawuconcenter.org is International Center for Law and Economics main website, and we have a blog. I'll be the first to admit that it could be criticized for not being as accessible as it might be, but it's more accessible than other stuff we write. It's called Truth on the Market. It was started by me and a couple other law professors 30 years ago or something, but now it's largely these technology, antitrust, sort of regulatory topics, and I think it's pretty fun. And our guy who does the graphics for it is great. He's really figured out the AI that produces graphics that are great for our content. So you should check it out, and it's truthonthemarket.com.
Fantastic. We'll get all of that on the screen and in the notes. Everyone,
Great.
go check that out. And again, once again, thank you, Geoffrey Manne, for joining us today, talking antitrust and all this fantastic stuff. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks,
Until
John. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Until next time, when we have another interesting guest, such as Geoffrey Manne, this is Big John. Join me next time for the big questions. Peace, everyone.